In the realm of the Pharaohs, some of mankind's oldest and largest cities are being built. An urban revolution that has long been overlooked. For unlike the impressive stone temples, most traces of settlement have disappeared today. Yet researchers are gaining ever deeper insights into the urban life and residential culture of the ancient Egyptians. From Memphis and Thebes on the Nile to Alexandria on the Mediterranean, this is the story of Egypt's metropolises. The Nile is Egypt's main artery. Where it flows, there is agriculture and traffic. The mighty river thus creates the basis for the emergence of big cities. Like Cairo, today's capital. With about 20 million inhabitants, it's the largest metropolitan region on the African continent, and the site of the beginnings of urban revolution in Egypt. It begins almost 5,000 years ago with a creation myth. According to the ancient Egyptians, the primordial mound rose from the primordial sea, where Cairo is today, the legendary beginning of the world. The primordial mound became the model for Egyptian architecture. Today, researchers can locate this place exactly. The primordial mound is said to have risen where once stood the largest temple district in Egypt, the magnificent cult center of the sun god in Heliopolis. Yet it's a challenge to trace the ancient temple city. For where Heliopolis once lay, today stretches the Moloch of Al-Matariya, a district of Cairo. An Egyptian-German research team is trying to recover and evaluate the remains of the ancient cult site.
Such interaction between the buildings, the people, and you work in the midst of all this. You need first to control your archaeological and scientific work, but also you be clever in communicating and how to control and accept and people and try to live together in a proper way.
The finds give a first impression of how Heliopolis developed. Since its beginnings in the 4th millennium BC, the site was gradually enlarged around the original temple. The most sensational discovery so far, fragments of a stone slab. It's the ancient ground plan of a temple, similar to those found in many later Egyptian cities. When exactly the sanctuary was built cannot be determined anymore. But the plan shows that there were at least 3 mighty gateways, decorated with 4 flagpoles each.
Heliopolis, until very recent times, has remained largely unknown. We know it was a site with a classic huge enclosure wall around the temple. Some of the oldest obelisks known are there from the Middle Kingdom. But only in recent times has an Egyptian-German mission been excavating there and, finding major pieces that come from what must have been a fantastic, city of obelisks in its own right.
Enormous obelisks once stood in the temple district of Heliopolis, the city of the sun. From the 3rd millennium until shortly before the beginning of our era, Heliopolis is the prime cult center for the sun gods Atum and Ra. Yet although the myth of the primordial hill may suggest otherwise, Heliopolis is not the oldest city of Egypt. Those looking for traces of the first great metropolises must travel further up the Nile. To Hierakonpolis, the ancient capital of Upper Egypt. It emerges around 3,500 years BC, when several villages coalesce into the oldest known urban settlement in Egypt. For 500 years, Hierakonpolis remains the religious and political center of Upper Egypt. A city built of mud, the most important building material of the Egyptians. Bricks are made from Nile mud, sand, and straw. The mixture is pressed into a wooden mold and smoothed by hand. Then it's simply left to dry in the sun.
Most of the structures in ancient Egypt were not stone, like the pyramids and the temples. Even the palaces of the kings were largely built of mud brick. The Nile silt gave ancient Egyptians building material for their structures of everyday life, their houses, their villages, and their towns.
The clay is a gift from the Nile, but the river also reclaims its gift. Unlike stone temples, earthen buildings are not built to last forever. After 5,000 years, only a few traces of the former capital remain. For archaeologists, the transience of the building material is a challenge. The desert has long since reclaimed the land, yet sometimes catastrophes of the past prove a stroke of luck for research.
This is the house of a potter who, fortunately for us, burnt his house down with his own kiln, ensuring its incredible preservation because it's been cut into the native dirt, and otherwise it would have eroded away. But because he burnt it and made it like pottery, it's red like pottery now because of the fire, it's preserved it against the wind and the elements. So we can see and get a feel for how the ancient Egyptians at this time actually lived.
The pottery workshop is part of an entire settlement of adobe buildings. Almost 10,000 people live here, house to house. About 5,000 years ago, Hierakonpolis is an urban center, a megacity. The tallest building is the temple for the falcon-headed god, Horus. The Falcon City plays a key role in the history of Egypt. From here, around 3100 BC, King Nama conquers the north of the country, uniting Upper and Lower Egypt to form the first territorial state in history. With Nama, the prehistory of Egypt ends and the so-called early period begins. It encompasses the first two dynasties. Of the rulers of the first dynasty, little is known. Stone carvings from this period tell of warlike conflicts with neighboring peoples. A total of 31 dynasties ruled over Egypt. Ancient king lists suggest that during the second dynasty, the country was again divided into Upper and Lower Egypt. Until Khazakemwi, last king of the second dynasty, reunifies the empire. With King Djoser, the second pharaoh of the third dynasty, the early period ends and the far better researched Old Kingdom begins. In the Old Kingdom, a new center of power emerges, right on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt, near the temple city of Heliopolis, Memphis. For about 3,000 years, the new residential city becomes one of the most important political centers of the country. Its name derives from the ancient Egyptian term Menefer, constant and beautiful. Yet little of the ancient splendor remains. The scanty leftovers do not date from the founding period and are located in which is now Mitrahina, a southern suburb of Cairo.
The problem when approaching a city like Memphis from an archaeological point of view is that, for one thing, every year the Nile has deposited sediments. So layers that are 3,000 years old may be several meters below the surface. Furthermore, the Nile has regularly shifted its bed from east to west and west to east, so that some stages of the ancient settlement may have been completely destroyed by the Nile.
It's this special location at the southern end of the Nile Delta, at the entrance of the Nile Valley, that allows Memphis to grow. The Egyptian chronicler Manetho reports that a fortress with white walls was built here. There's also evidence of a huge temple to the city god Ptah. He's considered the patron of creation and the arts. But hardly a stone of Ptah's sanctuary stands upright anymore. Nevertheless, today archaeologists can draw a picture of ancient Memphis.
There are a good many written sources. For instance, the so-called hymns to the city that exist for Memphis as well as for Thebes. Then we have ancient Greek authors who tell us about the city of Memphis, its important buildings, so that we can get a picture of the ancient city, even if it's no longer preserved today.
Around 1300 BC, numerous sanctuaries form the great temple complex in the heart of the city. Triumphal processions, sacrificial festivals, and coronation ceremonies take place here. The Greek name of the main temple of the god Ptah, as Aegyptos, later becomes the country's name, Egypt. With up to 30,000 inhabitants, Memphis may have been the largest city in the world at the time. West of the capital, another defining element of Egypt's urban culture develops. The necropolis of Sakara. The city of the dead is in a sense the cemetery of Memphis. Numerous rulers of Egypt find their final resting place here. The most prominent tomb and landmark of Sakara is the Step Pyramid for King Djoser. It's about 4,700 years old and presumed to be the first structure in Egypt made of stone. A marvel, for which its master builder, Imhotep, was celebrated during his lifetime and showered with all possible honors. His title, the Great of the Seeing, reveals Imhotep is not only the king's top architect, but also a high priest, and thus one of the most powerful men in the empire. As early as pre-dynastic times, that's before the Old Kingdom, Egyptian rulers were laid to rest under burial mounds. They refer to the primordial mound connecting heaven and earth. From them, the first stone mounds evolve, and eventually the pyramids. With time, they become ever more perfect, until they reach their apogee with the construction of the Khufu Pyramid in Giza. The tomb for the pharaoh thus becomes a landmark for the whole country, and has remained so.
Building the pyramids was a project that welded together the Egyptian society. Workmen were coming from all around the country, from the south and from the north. They came together for this huge project. They were taking pride in being Egyptians.
Next to the City of the Dead, another settlement is being built on the Giza Plateau. It's no less than a city of its own. Here live the well-paid craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters and blacksmiths. They're even allowed to build their own burial site in the immediate vicinity of the City of the Dead. A privilege at that time. Simple workers, however, have to make do with primitive hut villages. The construction of the pyramids is a mammoth task and a back-breaking job. The ancient Greek chronicler Herodotus estimated that it took 100,000 men 20 years to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. Today it's assumed that more than 20,000 people toil daily on the construction site, in the nearby quarry and in the settlements.
There were specialists who were stonemasons and this, that, and the other. And we know about them because we actually have where they lived on the Giza, near the Giza Plateau. We have their houses, we had the big places where they ate, we had their places where their beer was made, where their bread was baked, the drains where all of their water went. So it's really fantastic because we have all of these things.
In the late 19th century, archaeologists discover a similar city up the Nile, at the eastern entrance of the fertile Fayum Basin. It was needed for the construction of the pyramid of Senusret II.
At Al-Lahun, we see quite clearly that these settlements were planned according to a grid.
The layout of Al-Lahun shows a regular street grid. All houses are designed following a uniform pattern. Stone canals indicate a regulated sewage disposal system.
It can be assumed that there was one original settlement that served as a model, even at the beginning of pharaonic history.
There are also indications of elaborate town planning in the provinces. As their giant empire cannot be properly administered from the capital, the Egyptians divide their country into smaller units, so-called nomes. One of these regional centers is Edfu. The city on the west bank of the Nile still exists today. 200,000 people live here. In its historical part stands the Temple of Horus, one of the best preserved temple complexes in Egypt, albeit from Greek times. Edfu has been excavated since 2005 and is one of the best researched settlements in Egypt. Apart from foundation walls of 3,700-year-old grain silos, there's clear evidence of urban planning.
There are several terms in pharaonic Egypt for cities or settlements. Hieroglyphs provide some hints. The so-called determinative at the end of the word shows a round settlement with a gridded system inside.
The hieroglyph for city and the hieroglyph for village both show a settlement pattern still widespread today, oriented along two main traffic axes. From this four-way division derives our term city quarter.
So the grid system for cities was not invented by the Greeks, but about 2,000 years earlier in pharaonic Egypt.
Yet with the rise of regional power centers like Edfu, the pharaoh's control over his empire slips away. After about 800 years, the central government collapses and the Old Kingdom ends. What follows is the so-called First Intermediate Period, a short interval of violent conflicts between the south and the north. In Upper Egypt, Thebes becomes the new hub of power. Here reigns Mentuhotep II, who around 2000 BC succeeds in reuniting the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt. the time of the Middle Kingdom begins, and Thebes develops into a political and cultural center. However, it's not until the founding of the New Kingdom around 1500 BC that Thebes becomes a metropolis. At the time, around 20,000 people live in the city, and an estimated 1 million in the surrounding region.
Thebes has many names. In the Ilias, it was given the name Thebes of 100 Gates in order to distinguish it from the city that had the same name in Greece. On the other hand, Thebes was also called the southern Iunu, which means southern Heliopolis. The temples for Amun-Ra in Thebes were imitating these temples.
Around Thebes lie some of the largest and most famous monuments of ancient Egypt, the temples of Karnak, the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut, the tombs of the pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings, and the temple of Luxor. Time and again, one comes across the architectural model of Heliopolis. It's particularly conspicuous in the large obelisks, stone symbols linking heaven and earth. To the ancient Egyptians, the wandering shadow of the obelisks symbolizes the daily journey of the sun god from the east to the west. But they also use it to measure time. The sunlit day is divided into 10 sections, with 2 twilight hours added for evening and morning. Based on the obelisks, the first sundials are designed around 1500 BC. To understand how the obelisks were produced, and this from a single slab of rock, we must travel to Elephantine, an island in the Nile near Aswan. To the ancient Egyptians, it's a sacred place. As early as the Old Kingdom, they built a temple here for the goddess Satis, the guardian of the life-giving Nile flood. Only here, the rose granite reserved for the pharaohs can be found. This unfinished obelisk, too, is made of this precious material. 42 meters long and weighing 1,100 tons, it would have become the largest stone column in ancient Egypt. It was probably left uncompleted due to cracks. That's why it's still possible to study the working methods of the ancient Egyptians.
They would have been making openings beneath the obelisk, and then they would insert wooden beams, they would moisture them, then this wood would expand, and the whole obelisk would be released from the quarry. Afterwards, they would use a kind of stone that was harder than granite. In this case, it was diorite, to smoothen the surface of the obelisk.
Carving the trenches around the obelisk alone would have taken 130 men an entire year. Yet, to speed up the process, the workers probably took advantage of natural weathering and cracks.
Then, with ropes, it had to be pulled on a ramp that would be built out of mud brick until the banks of the Nile. Then it would be put on huge barges that would transport these obelisks down the Nile to Luxor, or even further down to nowadays Cairo.
The finished obelisks are loaded onto transport ships up to 80 meters long, and then towed down the Nile by rowboats from Aswan to Thebes. Once on site, they're pulled via ramps. Then the teams let them slide into a foundation filled with sand. In later times, the monumental stone needles are popular spoils of conquest throughout Europe. The ancient Romans, Napoleon Bonaparte, and the British, they all use obelisks from Egypt to add some of the splendor of the Pharaonic Empire to their own capitals. Even the Washington Monument is basically nothing more than a modern interpretation of the ancient obelisks. Splendor and glory on the Nile. Every pharaoh sees it as his duty to enlarge and embellish the Egyptian temples. Thus, more and more impressive buildings are erected around Thebes, like Karnak, the largest of all preserved temples. "134 columns once supported its wooden roof, a true forest of stones. "24 meters high, 104 meters long, and 52 meters wide, the Great Hall of Columns is a building of superlatives. Almost 1,000 years will pass before other civilizations match these achievements of the Pharaonic Empire. The stone temples of Thebes have survived the millennia. Even if nothing remains of the ancient adobe buildings, researchers today can draw an amazingly accurate picture of the city. Its residential areas lie on the eastern bank of the Nile. To protect their inhabitants from the heat, most of the houses have few windows, as is common in traditional North African buildings until modern times. Beyond the alleys of plain mud brick houses are the villas of priests and officials. The everyday life of this rich upper class can be reconstructed by numerous archaeological finds. The furnishings of their houses are luxurious and comfortable. Wooden chairs with backrests can be afforded only by the nobility and high officials. There are bathrooms with stone toilets. Below the opening, a vessel filled with sand, which was emptied regularly. The remains of an ancient Egyptian shower, a small room with a recessed limestone slab and a water drain. There's even evidence of leisure activities. Stick fencing seems to have been a popular pastime, as well as senet, a precursor of backgammon.
The upper classes did, no doubt, enjoy certain luxuries that lower classes didn't. I think there was a big divide between the very wealthy and the very poor, but I don't think ancient Egypt could have worked as a culture, society, and a civilization if the elite had been totally separate from the common people. I think Egypt was organized by households. You owed labor to your lord, but your lord owed you security, sustenance, food, and protection. The lower classes and the upper classes were more interdigitated or more embedded than we might think if we just use the term upper class or elite.
Yet, there are also revealing findings for the daily life of the workers. They were made on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun sets, and thus, according to the conceptions of the time, lies the threshold between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Here are the Necropolises of the New Kingdom. The tombs in the Valley of the Queens and Kings are deeply cut into the rock at the foot of the mountain Al-Qurn, literally the horn. Since its summit has the shape of a natural pyramid, it's probably reminded the ancient Egyptians of the mythical primordial hill. In the 19th century, archaeologists come across the foundation walls of a planned settlement, Set Ma'at, the place of truth, today known as Deir el-Medina. This is where between 1500 and 1000 BC, the craftsmen charged with constructing the rock tombs live. They left countless clay shards with sketches of everyday scenes. A mother breastfeeding. A woman dressing herself in front of a mirror. A boy herding a pig. And a farmer driving a cow in front of him. Inscribed pottery shards found in an ancient trash pit provide information about the settlement's water supply.
The ancient Egyptians were aware about the importance of water. We have indications already from the Old Kingdom that there were copper pipes used, but only on a very narrow scale. The ancient Egyptians used donkeys to transport the precious water in water jars over sometimes hundreds of kilometers to the places where the people would live.
It's an elaborate system that works well for a millennium and a half. Royal officials meticulously watch over allocation and consumption. Such clay jars used to carry drinking water have also been found in another ancient workers' settlement, at Amarna. However, those living here in the 14th century BC aren't meant to build rock tombs, but an entire new capital. Between the ancient capitals of Memphis and Thebes, the city of Akhenaten will rise on the east bank of the Nile, where the sun appears on the horizon. Such is the wish of Akhenaten, who wants to found his rule on a new religious concept.
Akhenaten is one of the best-known characters from ancient Egypt. Akhenaten put the sun god Aten into a very important and prominent position. He was completely against the Amun priests and the cult of Amun because they had become so wealthy, so important, and so powerful that they were really challenging the kingship. And also perhaps he did have a religious revelation and he decided that they had to go. But we will never really know the right answer.
It's a break with all that has hitherto been high and holy to the Egyptians. Under Akhenaten, there shall be only one ruler, and only one god, Aten, the solar disk hovering over all. Akhenaten wants a radical new beginning. Even his intended capital is not based on an existing settlement. It literally breaks new ground. Rock reliefs describe the ambitious project like ancient construction site signs. I am building Akhenaten on the side of the sunrise, a site chosen by the god Aten himself.
He left all of these stelae that in fact tell us about why he chose this place and how he chose it. And basically it was a place where the sun rose in a very particular way in front of the horizon, and also because he said that it was basically a virgin site. It had no history of other gods. And so this is where he built his capital dedicated to the Aten and said that I am in fact never going to leave this area ever again.
In just 3 years, the entire city is built. Akhenaten, a new capital for 50,000 subjects, begun in the 5th year of Akhenaten's reign, and as it's handed down, completed in his 8th year on the throne. In the center rises the new sanctuary, the Temple of Aten, next to the great palace of the ruler. Reliefs on the wall show the royal couple in prayer. Yet the new cult does not endure. Following his death, Akhenaten is outlawed as a heretic, and his capital is abandoned only 12 years after its completion. For researchers, it's a stroke of luck, since, unlike Memphis and Thebes, Akhenaten was never built over. As the center of the sun cult, it's an architectural peculiarity and provides unique insights into ancient Egyptian urban development.
Until then, residential buildings in pharaonic Egypt were built of mud bricks. But here we see how, in the large villas, in the houses of important and rich people, bricks give way to stone. We have magnificent entrances, columns in the main reception rooms, or window grills, all made of stone. This clearly sets aside these houses from those of simpler people.
For the nobility, you have some very wonderful villas with their own little temples and wells and ponds and places for their cattle and their weaving and this, that, and the other. So you really have larger things, which are almost like estates, but shrunk down. And then in between and around them are smaller houses, which one suspects belong to people who were associated with the main house. So you get this idea of someone important and dependents circling around, and you get all kinds of levels of people, because we know that there are people who are sculptors, who have their houses as well as their workshops, people who are butchers, bakers, police officers, as well as, of course, all the members of the court elite.
Increasing use of stone in construction is a challenge for Akhenaten's builders. Until now, houses have been built either from air-dried mud bricks or, like the pyramids, from large, individually matched blocks of stone. Yet Akhenaten is in a hurry, so a new revolutionary construction method is needed. Instead of the time-consuming process of matching the stones, in Akhenaten, one-size-fits-all blocks are used, called talatat. They're easy to stack and to transport. Thanks to these ancient Egyptian precursors of today's industrial bricks, the new city can be built in record time. The talatat from Akhenaten's time are sought after as building material, and thus recycled in the temples of Thebes as filling material. Akhenaten is not the only pharaoh who wants to create a monument for himself by ordering a new capital to be built. More than 50 years after his death, one of the most famous of all pharaohs takes up his reign. Ramses II. He not only reigns longer than any other pharaoh, over an impressive span of 66 years, he also becomes the undisputed master builder of ancient Egypt. With the Ramesside in Thebes, he creates a monument for eternity. And it's during his reign that the famous rock temple of Abu Simbel is built. Yet of his capital, built in the 13th century BC on the Nile Delta, hardly anything remains. The city of Ramesside is known mainly thanks to the Old Testament. It's said that from here Moses led his people from Egyptian captivity.
Ramesside was founded foremost as a military settlement, not merely as a residence. We're here in an extremely good strategic location, on an island in the easternmost arm of the Nile, about a day's journey away from the Mediterranean. So the city is well protected from any enemy. And if the enemy approaches across the sea, you have about a day before his army can reach the city.
Well protected and at the same time ideally located for campaigns into neighboring kingdoms. This is how Ramses II had planned it. An animation shows Ramesside with extensive residential quarters, consisting of small huts standing close together, individual houses, and magnificent villas. On the north bank, there is the huge temple district. And inside the walls is the camp of a potent army.
In der Stadt selbst finden wir
In the
nun
city, there was a
eine
great
ganze
number
Reihe
of military
militärischer
facilities,
Einrichtungen,
as our
die wir
excavations have
mittlerweile
shown.
auch durch die Grabung nachweisen können. Dazu gehören eben
There are stables for the horses of the chariots,
Pferde der Streitwagen,
but also a kind of drill yard for charioteers, as well as workshops, which is certainly related to the production of things needed by the military.
militärischer Güter in Zusammenhang zu bringen sind.
Ancient sources confirm the military importance of the city. Hierakonpolis serves as a mustering place for infantry, as a garrison for chariots, and provides a port for the navy. Yet only 200 years on, in about 1100 BC, the city is abandoned. The reasons are not known, but there are clues.
Ein plausibler
One
Erklärungsversuch
plausible
ist,
explanation
dass der
is that the
Nilarm
branch of the
versandet
Nile,
ist,
where
an dem
P. Ramesside
Ramesside
was
gelegen
located,
hat.
silted
Da
up.
der Nil die
And since the Nile
Lebensadern
was the lifeline of ancient Egypt and the main traffic route, a capital was inconceivable in a place that was cut off from the Nile.
am Nil lag.
Under Ramses II, Egypt enjoys internal peace for almost 50 years. However, the Pharaoh's empire is threatened from the outside. While mighty fortress cities secure the Nile Valley in the south, foreign invaders prove dangerously active in the north. Around 1600 BC, foreign rulers, called Hyksos in Egyptian, bring the Nile Delta under their control for the first time. About 1,000 years later, it's the turn of the Persians. They make Lower Egypt a province of their empire. Then in 332 BC, a conqueror from northern Greece ushers in a new era. Alexander the Great. When his father dies, the 20-year-old prince takes over the throne. That same year, he leads his first campaign. He then moves against the Persian Empire and defeats its king. The path to Egypt is clear. In monumental reliefs, Alexander has himself immortalized as victor over the Persians and as rightful ruler over Egypt, blessed by the Egyptian gods.
Alexander quite consciously sought to project a counter-image to Persian rule over Egypt by placing himself in local traditions. And this certainly resulted in him being regarded by the Egyptians as a kind of liberator.
His name remains forever associated with the founding of a new city on the Mediterranean Sea. Alexandria. It's built according to Greek models in a checkerboard pattern. Soon it eclipses even ancient Athens. Around the time of Christ's birth, it's the second largest city in the world after Rome, with an estimated population of 300,000. Its landmark can be seen from afar, the Pharaohs of Alexandria, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, shown here according to ancient descriptions.
Estimates of its height vary between 110 and 160 meters. If the latter were correct, the pharaohs would have been higher than most Gothic cathedrals. It's not impossible, but probably a height of about 110 meters will be correct.
Yet Alexandria is nothing special when it's founded. A typical Greek colonial city, like many on the Mediterranean. This changes only after Alexander's death. Ptolemy, one of his generals, has the king's body transferred to Alexandria, and thus legitimizes himself as successor to the ruler's throne. Thus, Ptolemy establishes the last pharaonic dynasty of ancient Egypt. Alexandria, where Alexander the Great is presumed to have his final resting place, experiences a massive boom. Greeks and Macedonians come to the city in large numbers. The who's who of intellectual antiquity gathers in the world-famous library. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria develops into a melting pot of cultures. From the exchange between Egyptians and Greek conquerors, something new emerges. Also, in matters of faith. The ruins of the Serapeum bear witness to this. It was the center of worship of Serapis, a cross of Zeus, the Greek father of the gods, and Osiris, the Egyptian god of the dead.
The cult of Serapis, which found its final architectural expression in the Serapeum, was practiced prior to the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great. It was the Ptolemies who transferred it to the new capital, Alexandria. Ptolemy I usurps this cult, which is Egyptian at its core, and dresses it in Greek garb. The cult statue looks completely Greek, as if it were imported from Greece.
Alexander himself is elevated to the status of a god. His tomb has not been found to this day.
The Ptolemies established a cult around Alexander in their empire. Its priest is perhaps the most important priest of all in the Ptolemaic Empire. So the importance of Alexander for the Ptolemies is obvious. His tomb was in the palace district in Alexandria. There's certainly the possibility to find remains of it. However, to do this, you need more specific information about where to look. You can't just dig up a metropolis like Alexandria. You need reliable indications. That nothing speaks against the possibility that Alexander's tomb may one day be found.
Any archaeological search in a densely populated metropolis is probably like looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. For ancient Alexandria has not only fallen victim to modern development. The coast looks very different today than it did 2,300 years ago. The ancient causeway to Pharaohs Island has been completely built over by the inexorably growing city. Other parts of ancient Alexandria sank into the sea after an earthquake, followed by a tsunami in 365 AD. They lie underwater to this day, off the coast of the modern city, where parts of the ancient royal quarter too are believed to have been. In the 1990s, underwater archaeologist Frank Godiel set out on a search. His spectacular finds give a glimpse of the splendor of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Countless amphorae and blocks of solid stone still lie at the bottom of the sea. The foundation of the lighthouse was often searched for, but never found. Yet, even if it's lost forever, the Pharaohs of Alexandria symbolizes a high point of Egyptian urban culture like no other building.
Alexander, for me, is like a big synapse. It transmits ancient Egypt as it now was, as it had, morphed, as it had developed through 3,000 years. But Alexandria and the Ptolemaic dynasty transmitted that to the world of Rome and thence Europe.
The Macedonian dynasty rules Egypt for 300 years. The last Ptolemaic on the pharaoh's throne is also the most famous, Cleopatra VII. Yet the country on the Nile has long been dependent on the Romans. With cleverness and skill, Cleopatra wins over the conquerors. But her success is short-lived. With Cleopatra, the empire on the Nile ends. Egypt becomes a Roman province. But the deeds and achievements of its people outlast time and shape history to this day. The Egyptian metropolises are the starting points of an urban revolution. The Egyptians, pioneers of modern town planning, set standards with their monumental buildings for over 3,000 years. From cultural temples like the Louvre in Paris to gambling temples in Las Vegas, the architectural legacy of ancient Egypt lives on.